Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast. Now, one of the things I'm seeing more and more is the idea that if data is not managed correctly, it could go from being the biggest asset to a biggest liability in an organisation, especially with things like GDPR fines. But could data privacy and compliance laws eventually risk just becoming nothing more than speeding tickets for those big major enterprises? Because progress from governing bodies like recent bipartisan data privacy bills in the US or the EU's new focus on unethical AI, yes, they're all big steps in the right direction. But recently levied fines and pushback against new regulations could suggest that compliance will not enforce protection so much as force companies to budget for its existence. And this is a topic that I wanted to explore in greater detail, and I've got a great guest for that today. Her name is Anne Hardy, and she believes that there's an opportunity for both big tech and government regulators to set a precedent for good compliance and regulation. So I'm incredibly excited to get Anne onto the podcast today and learn more from her insights and experience and work at Talend and so much more. So buckle up and hold on tight as I beam your ears all the way to California, where Anne Hardy is waiting to share her story, her insights, and the work that she's doing, and so much more. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Anne. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Sure. So my name is Anne Hardy. I've been the CISO, so Chief Information Security Officer at Talend for about 2 years now. So my job is pretty much about security, I would say. Covering product security, internal security, security compliance, and a lot of work on privacy, which I'm sure we'll talk about.
Yeah, and before we begin on that, I'm going to take you back even further. I mean, can you share your origin story and remember how those worlds of technology and security collided for you and put you on this path you're on today? Can you remember that moment?
Yeah. So actually, it's pretty random. So technology was not random. So when I grew up, I was really interested in mathematics and studied in France. And when you study mathematics and you're pretty good at school, I mean, the normal path is to study engineering. So I studied engineering in one of the grandes écoles in France and started to work in, I would say computer science, software engineering, development, loved it, and did a lot of things before I actually got my first job working on security, which was with SAP, where I started the research center of SAP on security back in the early 2000s. And that's how I got started on security. So security was not really by choice then. It was more like very random that it just fell on me that SAP wanted to have a research center focusing on security. And I was there and I was definitely interested, curious about it. Hired a lot of security researchers that just taught me all about security that I learned early in my job there, and then took my first CISO job. Was it 4 years ago? Almost 4 years ago, in a startup in San Francisco. So it was my comeback to security then, I love the domain. It's very transversal, very changing, requires a lot of work with a lot of people across all the departments of a normal company, I would say. And since I've done a lot of things in different domains, it's really good for me because I think I can put myself in the shoes of most of the people I work with.
It's a great story. And I think after interviewing over nearly 2,000 people now, and I always ask that question, I'm always very fascinated by the story and what put them on the path that they're on. And everybody, I would say, almost everybody will say that it was almost random. It happened out of the blue. It was a happy accident. It's almost like the universe gives us all that little nudge in the right direction when we're ready for it, doesn't it?
Yeah. And I think also, we tend, if you have those moments where, well, there is a change happening and you start to think about what you're doing, that's when, as you say, if you listen to the universe, that's sometimes when you hear signs of things that maybe could be interesting things for you to do. And that's what happened to me, right? Sometimes you slow down and you just, you have those moments where you're, I don't want to say limbo, but you're like, oh, what am I going to do next? And that's when interesting things can happen. So, I've always encouraged everyone to sometimes to stop and just to reflect on what they are doing, just because that's when interesting things can come to you and happen.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And of course, your path led you to Talend, where you lead the way in data integration and data integrity and play this crucial role in changing the way that the world makes decisions. But for people that are listening all over the world and listening and hearing about you guys for the first time, can you just expand on the kind of problems that you're helping your customers with and what makes you different from other solutions out there?
Yeah, so a lot of things. Well, I guess everybody realized that digital businesses really rely on data. More than digital businesses, actually. So everybody is like collecting a lot of data and trying to make sense of all the data that they collect for analysis, for predictions, for making better decisions. And it's been harder and harder for companies to really manage all this data and to govern the data. And so what we do at Talend, we have a series of products really to help companies make sure they have data that they can trust, data that is not really outdated, data that could be used for analysis, predictions, data that can be managed and easily used by people. A lot of companies spend a lot of time collecting, cleaning. And so we are trying to reduce the time so that people can really spend time doing the things that they need to do, which are, nowadays, a lot of companies have data scientists, people that really spend time using all the data that they collect just for making the best use of that for their business, right? So that's our products are a little bit obscure. I agree with normal people because data is invisible. So our products are very invisible for a lot of people, especially in the consumer world. But we help definitely a lot of companies doing a better job with all this gold mine of data that they acquire from various places.
And if we look across every industry, I think so much has changed in the last 2 years. And if we look at the world of data, I would say that arguably data has gone from the biggest asset in an organization to the biggest liability if it's not managed properly. But just to set the scene, can you tell me a little bit more about how outdated attitudes towards personal customer data collection that lead to compliance breaches? Can you expand a little on that just to set the scene for people?
Yeah, so there are, everybody has heard about the GDPR and CCPA and those new privacy regulations that really help businesses and people understand each other and have a good base of working together, right? And most of the data that is really critical, sensitive, for those regulations are personal data, so data that could potentially identify people and allow businesses to really, I would say not steal, but touch things that are very private for people. And those are, in general, you could think about anything that can identify a person or thing that could potentially, lead to disasters or payment information, social security information, thing that you could really have a lot of power with if you really got your hands in those data that belong to others. So it's really, I really like, I think, was it Bruce Schneier who talks about I think data becoming, being the biggest pollution of the 21st century and privacy, being the biggest environmental challenge of the planet right now. So I think it's a good analogy with what's going on.
And there's such a huge focus on this area at the moment. But I'm curious, do you think there is a big opportunity for both big tech and government regulators, etc., to set a precedent for good compliance and good regulation?
My wish has always been that big tech and governments work together instead of fighting against each other. I'm not sure it's happening yet, because I think, there is definitely a gap between what's happening in big tech companies and how they use data and what I think the government is trying to defend. So working together for me would be the best way to come up with regulations that could be enforced. I think right now the biggest issues with some of the regulations we have is that they are very hard to enforce. And because they are so, they are hard to enforce and also sometimes very distant from what business can do. So I think, if we could just have those big tech companies who have very often the means to put people to work on those issues with government and come up with, a middle ground that could be more realistic for companies to work on. That would be my wish. I don't think it's happening yet.
And before you came on the podcast, I always try and do a little bit of research on the guest. And I read that you believe that international tech giants can actually turn compliance into teachable moments for smaller companies dealing in data. So can you expand on that belief?
Yeah. So, those big tech firms have, I don't want to say armies of people, but they have large groups of people really working on those topics. And usually companies like us or like mine, we turn to them just to look at how they deal with certain things, certain aspects. And very often they do, I'm not saying that they do the perfect job, right? We hear that some of them, of course, they get compliance fines and things like that. But in general, they are better at doing what they do that most smaller companies will have less means to. Being compliant is a complicated job. Just making sure that you are compliant with all regulations that apply to you is very complicated nowadays because there are so many regulations. And I think those companies have better means and better abilities to do that. So I turn to them just to find information about how they do certain things and as examples. And I think they could maybe help us, smaller companies, just apply some of the things they do in a better way instead of us being the ones really searching for the information. So so that's what really I mean. They could really turn themselves into real good examples of things that others should do. Because nowadays, honestly, I think we are very concerned when we hear about the Facebook and the others of the world doing certain things certain ways. But if regulation enforcers were looking at smaller companies, they would probably find out that smaller companies are doing a worse job than those guys. So I feel a little bad that we make the public and the consumers believe that the big ones are the bad people. But I think if we look closer at the small ones, they're probably not doing a better job. Of course, they have maybe less impact because they are not as big, but still, I think in terms of privacy, the big ones might do a better job.
And over here in Europe, we've kind of seen the kind of fines that are being put from GDPR, and there's some big fines there. But on that front, I read a great quote from you on how data privacy and compliance laws could run the risk of just becoming speeding tickets for the big tech companies. But can you tell me more about that fear and why compliance regulators need to focus on smaller companies, not just those offering major payouts?
I say that because if you give a speeding ticket or if you give a fine to a company that can afford the fine, it will probably be invisible to them. And for small companies that probably do things that are not compliant, I think it might make sense for them also to feel that they are they should be at fear of compliance rules. I mean, right now we know as smaller companies that we are probably less targeted by regulators. And it gives us a little bit of an escape route, right? Since feeling like, well, that's, and I don't think that's right, because everybody should be put on the same rules. At the same time, enforcing is hard, right? So regulators are probably struggling now to find a way to enforce their regulations on everyone. I mean, it's not something you can really automate nowadays. I'm not sure it's going to be possible at some point, but and that's probably why they go after the big ones, right? Because that's where the money is, and they can really make a lot of noise about this. But they probably scare to a certain level the big ones, and but at the same time they taint a little bit the image of the big ones. While I was saying before, I think the small ones are not doing a better job at this point. So it's a little bit, we are a little bit tricky and weird situation right now, I think, regarding compliance.
Absolutely. And you also write many articles online. And when I was browsing through them, one that really stood out for me was when you said for CISOs and artificial intelligence to evolve, trust is a must. So can you expand on that for listeners who have not read that article?
I mean, as I was mentioning earlier, I mean, data is it's this mysterious thing, right? That people know that it exists, but it's not physical. It's not something you see easily, right? So it's somewhere in the navigating through flows that are sometimes invisible. And now you add, so data is already a problem that a lot of people realize, well, maybe some people are doing things with my data that I'm not aware of. But I have no way to know that, right? I have no way to control. So therefore, we start to put regulations in place that are supposed to prevent people from doing certain things. And now on top of that, now you have artificial intelligence, which is this other layer of things that people can do, which are super powerful, that are very often not, I mean, I don't want to say discussed, but that not obvious or visible to people. And I think right now the problem we have is that there's this distancing happening between what people know that is happening and what people really do. And I think when I was talking about this trust is just making sure that we are bridging the gap as security expert, artificial intelligence expert, between what people need to know and what is really happening. So that there is this level of trust. I mean, I was giving in the article, I think, the example of, I'm not sure that really was artificial intelligence, but you could feel that there is, in order for people to nowadays agree to use something that is going to collect data, that is going to obviously analyze data, they have to feel a certain level of trust in what is going to happen behind the scenes. So there is this transparency dilemma that we have. How much do we have to say to people? So in order for them to trust that what we're going to do is right for them. And I think we have not really found this right balance. And even myself, I mean, sometimes I feel like, oh, somebody's asked me to install this application, but I don't really know what they are doing. And if I don't know enough of what they are doing, I'm not going to do it, right? So I think we have this place where people are suspicious because they don't know enough. And I think it's our job as CISO and artificial intelligence expert to be a little bit more transparent about what we are doing, so that what we are working on is actually used or trusted by people so that they use it.
And are there any tips or advice that you would leave the listeners, for anyone listening thinking about how they can optimize their company's approach to data privacy and cybersecurity? Is there any tips or insights you could leave us with?
I think for me, the key right now is just making sure that there is strong collaboration between people working on privacy, which are really, I mean, most of the time in companies in the legal department, and people working on security, and also people working on data. So there is, I think for me, there is this magical intersection that is super powerful nowadays between data scientists or data science, privacy lawyers or regulators and security people. And I think some companies have realized that we really have to work together, and just so, because we cannot just have our jobs in silos, so that we can really enable better data privacy. I mean, even though, as I was saying before, data privacy is really the biggest challenge of, I think, our century. But yeah, for me, that's a key, just making sure that those three entities in every organization, which I think we have right now, are working together and collaborating.
Fantastic. And we started the podcast today talking about your origin story and what put you on this path and your career in tech. And I'm now going to have a bit of fun with you and ask you, what has been the soundtrack to your journey in tech? I'm sure you do a lot of flying around. You've probably got some noise-cancelling earphones too. But is there any a song or a piece of music that has accompanied you on your career? And you can share that song and story. We'll add that song to our Spotify playlist.
It's funny. So the funny story about me, and actually my kids just laugh about me all the time, is that in general, I have a song that I listen to pretty much nonstop for a few weeks, and then I switch to something else. So there is no real song that has been following me for a long time, but I have a playlist that I use. I do a lot of running and biking, and there is I use a playlist that has songs that I usually come back to very often. So there is I love Adele, so yeah. That's one of the. So I tend to listen to a lot of songs from her. Then a lot of British singers, which I guess doesn't surprise anyone because I think they are the best. But yeah, I don't. There is no real song right now that comes to mind. But yeah, so that's. But if you just keep Adele, I think that's good.
Is there one particular Adele song when you're running back home? Is there one that gets you pumping and ready to get home? Would it be Rolling in the Deep or something like that?
But so actually the Skyfall theme, do you know the James Bond? Yeah, so that's one that I really love.
Love it. We'll get that on the playlist. But before I let you go, for anyone listening want to find out more information about anything we've talked about today, check out some of your written work, find Talend online. What's the best starting point?
So talend.com, definitely. You can also find me on LinkedIn. There are a bunch of articles. You can also find Talend on LinkedIn as well. That's probably a good place to start.
Fantastic. I'll add those links to the show notes so people can find you nice and easily. So much I've loved about chatting with you today about that big opportunity for both big tech and government regulators to set that precedent for good compliance and good regulation, but more than anything for sharing your story as well and the songs you listen to on your run too. So thank you for bringing all of that to life today and taking the time to share it with me.
Yeah, thank you, Neil. It was a pleasure.
I just loved hearing more from Anne today around those outdated attitudes towards personal consumer data collection that end up leading to those compliant breaches that we see on a regular basis now. And also how international tech clients can actually turn compliance into a teachable moment for smaller companies that deal in data too. And why compliance regulators need to focus on smaller companies and not just those offering those big major payouts. Food for thought indeed. But over to you. We've got people listening all over the world, and data collection and the compliance and regulations around it affect every single business out there. So please let me know your thoughts by emailing me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. My website is techblogwriter.co.uk, and connect with me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram at Neil C. Hughes. But if you do hit connect or follow, send me a quick message. Don't just hit the follow button. I want to know who you are. I want to have a good chat with you and get to know you a little bit better too. But other than that, I'll be back in your podcast feed bright and early tomorrow. But thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.